Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today to present to AFDO on this very important topic of leveraging enterprise risk management and reducing salmonellosis. Some of you might have looked at this topic and thought this is a rather odd topic to address as a potential solution or a strategy in reducing salmonellosis. My goal is to explain why maybe it's not so odd. Maybe this becomes a relatively useful tool in an important strategy in achieving this very important goal. My name is Melanie Newman. I'm with Matrix Sciences. I'm the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the organization. We're a third-party contract laboratory and provide a host of risk management solutions to the industry. I've been in the space for 25 plus years, worked with several poultry and other USDA regulated facilities and FDA facilities who incorporate and are dual regulated facilities as well, and it can incorporate some of this thinking as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here. What we're going to discuss today is what is enterprise risk management anyways? What are some enterprise risks? In addition to food safety and the important goal of reducing salmonella in poultry and other products that are susceptible, what are we competing against by way of other enterprise risks inside corporations and companies who have a host of risks to have to manage every day? And then how can enterprise risk management, which I may often refer to as ERM for short, how can it be used to elevate food safety, to make it more integrated, to make it more sticky, if you will, in an organization so that it isn't the silo that a lot of us in the industry have experienced firsthand, witnessed, for example, and how does it become really, truly everyone's job? And how can ERM help ultimately serve as that one strategy or that one very important approach to reducing salmonellosis? I'll give you a brief example or two, summarize with some key takeaways, and be here to address questions. Foundationally speaking, what is risk management? It's a series of decisions, sometimes tough decisions that we have to make every day. We can reduce the risk, for example, instituting CCPs to reduce the risk of salmonella. We can transfer the risk. Perhaps we're relying on a co-manufacturer and they're the ones responsible. But understanding truly we're transferring perhaps only some of our risk as an enterprise. I'll get to that point in a moment. We might accept the risk. Hey, it is what it is. We understand salmonella is a risk in this type of product. We're going to do our best to manage that risk. But ultimately, we understand it's there, and getting to zero isn't going to be an option. We can avoid the risk. That's the one way getting to zero is an option, is some companies have just entirely gotten out of poultry production, for example. I know some companies who've sold off that portion of their company due to the risk. So these are just high-level brass tacks reminders of risk management, which then enterprise risk management will build upon. I think the key here, it's really important to remember that companies who are producing poultry and other protein type products, they're competing for better or for worse against a whole host of other enterprise risks. So what are some of those enterprise risks that they're competing against? Cybersecurity is a hot topic right now. Data breaches, ransomware attacks that can bring in a whole organization to its knees and simply cripple it and have catastrophic financial loss, which is operational loss, reputational loss. Some of these big data breaches we have seen in the news, it's brand reputation impact, adverse, very adverse. And ultimately also potentially a regulatory violation as well. And so these types of enterprise risks fall in those buckets of operational, regulatory, reputational risk. Companies are asked to manage all of those every day. How do we help industry really spotlight and really highlight the need to follow performance standards, to fund them, to fund food safety in a way that is much more at that enterprise level and on par and can compete with some of these other enterprise risks? So I'm going to talk to a little bit about that today. So, what is enterprise risk management? We've learned a few examples of what some enterprise risks are, but what do we do with those risks? I think it's important to realize that risk is, again, relative. This is a relative risk exercise. It's identifying potential risks, managing them appropriately, and providing reasonable assurances that the risk management strategy you adopted falls within your corporate risk tolerance. That's what companies are needing to achieve here. Typically, an ERM process happens annually, where a small group of C-suite professionals gather in a room, go perhaps get some input from other levels of the organization, sometimes not, and rank order the risks to the enterprise. How do you think they're doing that? One metric comes down to dollars. It's a financial metric. And so ultimately, and that's not necessarily a negative, the ultimate goal here is how do we empower the food safety professionals in these manufacturing and processing environments to be able to have that same conversation? What information do they need? How do they need to translate the vocabulary from hazard to risk? All these things I'll touch on in this presentation, because ultimately an enterprise risk management strategy helps a company take all of the risks, compare them relative to each other in their portfolio of risks, correlate them, and then appropriately resource them according to the relative risk they present. But ultimately, enterprise risk is a material balance sheet risk. It threatens the survival of an organization. It also becomes, again, a new vocabulary with that hazard to risk translation. For me, my operating definition and principle is that ERM really is a discipline, it's a culture, and it's a control structure to help an organization understand their risks, appropriately manage those risks within their own chosen risk appetite. And so, how do we help the industry understand that things like not only funding and following performance standards, but perhaps even selecting more stringent or lower standards to hold themselves to an even higher bar? Not the reason to do that isn't just a regulatory driver. If we snap our fingers and issue a regulation tomorrow, that's not necessarily going to achieve the behavior we might think it would achieve and have industry across the board adopt action. Yes, there's considerable, importance and drivers in regulation, but they're still having to manage all of these other enterprise risks. And if a cybersecurity attack poses a $500 million threat to the organization, and missing numbers on performance standards is going to pose a $20,000 threat to the organization, we can pretty much understand which is going to get more resources. So how do we leverage enterprise risk management and its philosophy in order to help food safety become a little bit more on balance and on par with these other risks? The origins come out of the wake of the food safety or the financial scandals of the early 2000s. Many of us are aware of. It applies to publicly traded companies via the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States here. Ultimately, publicly traded companies are required to establish internal controls for those risks that represent a material balance sheet risk. Sounds like a pretty good practice, right? So perhaps publicly traded companies are required to do this, but a lot of private companies adopt this approach of enterprise risk management as well, not simply because there's a regulatory driver, but because it helps them also mitigate their operational and their reputational risk in addition to regulatory risk, ultimately achieving that public health protection that's so important to us. What does it look like? Just briefly skim these criteria or elements. This enterprise risk management model emanates out of a group called COSO. It's the Committee of Organizing and Sponsoring Organizations. As we can see, what does this kind of look like? What are the similarities here? To me, when I saw this model, it hit me, this is HACCP. This is FSMA's preventive controls rules. This is a model to identify hazards and to prevent a preventative approach to monitor those controls accordingly and to communicate accordingly when we need to. I can just briefly show you what some of the overlays are. So performing a hazard analysis is just like the risk assessment that's required in this model. Having a food safety plan that identifies CCPs, process preventive controls, becomes your control activities. These types of food safety regulatory requirements very much align with this concept of enterprise risk management. So it's not going to be a foreign model necessarily, but when you look at the difference in the language and you see, oh, risk assessment, control activities, controlled environment, those are phrases that CFOs, who typically have the power of the pocketbook, understand. Hazard analysis, pathogens, CCPs, that's the language the food safety professional understands. So how do we help give information they need to be able to make the translation so both parties understand each other when they're in the boardroom talking about a very important topic such as reduction of salmonellosis? Just a few more examples here. I'm not going to belabor the point, but ultimately I think a point is enterprise risk management is a tool, a strategy to identify all of the enterprise risks and to manage them in an appropriate way to mitigate operational, reputational, and regulatory risk. So how do we help the poultry producers find the reward for doing so? And how do we encourage them to adopt even more stringent standards in a way that isn't necessarily a regulatory hammer? Well, we got a couple options. Scare tactic, or change our approach and change our vocabulary. So scare tactic, these are just some examples of this really happens. As we know, Wright County Eggs had the largest, salmonella related egg recall in history. Over 1,300 people fell ill, and it impacted the entire commodity, in part as referenced by the sign behind the gentleman's head that says recall all egg production. The whole entire industry suffers. The poultry industry understands that as well, and they're not apt or very keen on making the entire industry have a blemished record because there's a problem with one producer, for example. So I think there are opportunities and ways to really appeal to the industry as a whole through talking through these macro level risks that they've got to manage every day and trying to get some more information for the food safety professional. Peanut Corporation of America, another scary situation. This one's a little bit different. It was intentional. Prison was involved because of the intent. But ultimately, again, the industry suffers. So over 90 branded owners were impacted by this, and some branded owners that were not even involved and didn't even use the raw material suffered a significant loss in sales as a result. And that's something I think we're all on board in helping the poultry industry avoid. I keep talking about changing our vocabulary and translating hazard to risk. Hazard being salmonella. That is the potential that we have in poultry. The risk is how likely is it to cause harm and what's the impact. I know that looks very basic and it's a very basic graphic, but I think it's important that we understand it so we can communicate it to the industry in a way that they can understand it and translate that into those executive boardroom conversations where they're walking in behind that IT professional who's asking for significant resourcing for an IT related enterprise risk. Then in walks, and they can quantify it. And then in walks a food safety professional to say, well, we've got a hazard of salmonella. Some CFOs don't understand how that can equate to a risk that might materially impact the balance sheet and perhaps even cause bankruptcy and close their doors. So how ERM can help in this way is we need to recognize that industry actions will always be driven by the need to manage all enterprise risk, operational, regulatory, reputational. So creating more stringent regulatory restriction alone isn't going to achieve our desired outcome. But a collaborative approach with industry is really needed, where public health and food safety professionals are communicating back and forth in a way about the risks associated with Salmonella in financial terms. Ultimately, I think the goal here is that to reduce salmonellosis should be designed, and approaches to do so should be designed to ensure that salmonella contamination in finished product is seen as a material balance sheet risk, is seen as that material enterprise risk. So let me give you an example of what we see in industry and kind of the competition we're up against. So an example here of a cyber attack, that IT professional walking into that boardroom I just illustrated. They come in with data, first and foremost, and can quantify that the likelihood of a cyber attack is 1 in every 2 years. They've got the data to back it up. I've got some images here. I've got a link at the bottom of the slide. They can point to something that's outside of themselves and their own, 4 walls of data to say, here's what substantiates the likelihood. The impact, clearly operational, regulatory, reputational impact of a major cyber attack is there. In some of these analysis and some of these publicly available data, the estimated total of that impact is $380,000. So if the risk is 1 in every 2 years, that annualized financial risk to that company is $190,000. Pretty basic, pretty straightforward analysis. And so if that IT professional is asking for a $50,000 software platform to be a malware, application for the organization, when there's a risk that far outweighs that, perhaps they will definitely get, perhaps they'll get that funding. Now let's look at the food safety professional who walks in that boardroom after the IT professional. What's the likelihood of a Salmonella outbreak? Well, we think 1 in every 20 years because that's what's happening to us. Not, based upon, what we can kind of piecemeal through some public records, through recall announcements and things of that nature. We think it's once in every 20 years. Well, what's the impact? We definitely have operational, regulatory, and reputational impact here between downtime, product replenishment, product retrieval and disposition, potential closure of the facility either temporarily or permanently, lost sales, lost customers for reputational impact, recall, increased inspections for regulatory impact. Well, what's the cost of that? Well, we can add up some of that. We can take, customer account annualized revenue, for example, and make some assumptions that perhaps we'll lose that customer. But a lot of these costs are either what I will call soft costs, a little harder to quantify. But ultimately, what we're not seeing here is that third-party resource, that third-party data, those graphs that we saw in the cyber attack business case. And so ultimately, if we say, what's the estimated total of all of this risk of a recall every once in 20 years due to Salmonella, we say $10 million. Well, is it? A lot of industry is still relying on a GMA study of the cost of a recall that's fairly dated at this point. And ultimately, if the chance is 1 in every 20 years, and we're kind of guessing on that time frame, the annualized financial risk looks, well, is it higher? Is it lower than the IT related risk? We don't really know because we have to make some assumptions in food safety today. So how can public health agencies help industry get the information it needs in order to compete with these other enterprise risks? Where can they go to get readily available, substantiated data to say, I have a much more substantiated position on the likelihood, the impact, and ultimately can run some numbers on the risk in financial terms to the organization, so that I don't walk in that boardroom and say, we have a hazard of salmonella. We have a risk of salmonella happening. Yep, we do. We're handling poultry. Absolutely. What is the net impact, revenue wise or financial wise, to that organization, so they can understand the risk relative to the other risks in their portfolio, pretty much all of those other risks being measured by a financial metric. And food safety needs a bit of help with some additional information in order to be able to do that math and to translate hazard to risk and say salmonellosis outbreaks in poultry equate to this amount of an enterprise risk in dollars that could be a hit on our bottom line, that could potentially risk the survival of our organization. Ultimately, that's the power of an enterprise risk management strategy, principles, and foundation as applied to this topic, to be able to be a very effective strategy in reducing salmonellosis in the poultry industry and in commerce. So ultimately, our key takeaways here is that companies have numerous enterprise risks they have to manage, albeit extremely important. And I would argue there's nothing more important than public health protection. There are other risks in addition to food safety they have to manage. Risk is relative. ERM helps give you a model to aid in mitigating all of the risks an organization has to have to manage, and it increases opportunities for food safety risks by translating hazard to risk. Ultimately, this ensures that the boardroom understands the risks relative to the others and the rewards associated with investing in it, complying with performance standards, setting even more stringent requirements. And it can be even more powerful if public health can find ways to give industry additional information it needs to compete with these other types of enterprise risks. So with that, I hope that gave you an overview of what enterprise risk management is, how it can be leveraged to help elevate food safety, and how it can be leveraged to help reduce salmonellosis in this particular industry sector. Certainly available and happy to address any questions you may have. And thanks again for the opportunity.